We're of course so familiar with DRONAH's work because it's been so varied over a long period of time, but just a little something so we're all caught up with everything that Shikhaji's been doing. Shikha Jain is the founder-director of DRONAH. She's an architect with an extensive portfolio on cultural heritage that covers several World Heritage, conservation and museum planning projects across India and overseas. Besides successfully inscribing several sites in India on the World Heritage list, she has advised government organizations and UNESCO offices in Singapore, Malaysia, UAE, Myanmar, and Indonesia. She has represented India on the UNESCO World Heritage Committee and as a bureau member at the 45th session of the World Heritage Committee. She has co-edited Incredible Treasures, World Heritage Sites of India, a wonderful read, in 2021. She's currently involved in the nomination dossiers of the Maratha military landscapes of India and the historic ensemble of Orcha. Today, she will be addressing Bundela and Maratha Citadels between the 16th and 19th centuries. Shikhaji believes tracing their geopolitical narratives will help better understand the palatine and fortified landscape of the Bundelas and the Marathas and guide a potential approach for future archaeological excavations and conservation of these crucial sites. We're so happy you could join us today. Over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. A very good evening to everyone, and I would like to thank CSMVS and Dr. Mukherjee especially for inviting me today for this lecture. As has just been mentioned, I've been involved with these two specific areas, the area of Orcha and Bundelkhand region, as well as the Maratha military forts since 2017 and 2019, looking at it from various perspectives, and finally officially engaged with the Madhya Pradesh Tourism Board as well as with the Directorate of Archaeology, Maharashtra, for proposing these under UNESCO World Heritage listing. And through the years, I have looked at various aspects, both the research as well as the site situations and what exists on site. And it was very interesting for me to finally see how they actually relate, and there has been a dialogue between the Bundelas and the Marathas, and how these fortifications actually can be looked at in that perspective. And specifically from the geopolitical perspective is what I'm going to focus on currently. So my presentation is divided into three sections. The geopolitical context, I will just introduce on, why Bundelas and why the Marathas, or why these particular regions, what was the, logic of these regions in the overall Mughal period and the expansion of Mughal Empire in between the Mughal and the British. Then I'll talk about specifically the patrons, the Bundela and the Maratha patrons and their citadels. And lastly, I'll touch upon, how we can move forward with archaeology and conservation of these. I'll begin with giving you an overview of fortifications in the Indian subcontinent. There have been several studies looking at, what kind of assets we have in terms of fortifications. And this particular study, Cartographies of Warfare in the Indian Subcontinent by Monica Smith and Connor Newton, actually looked at a big data, analysis where they got a lot of data from various sources, field as well as digital, and looked at the extent of fortifications. And you can see the first map and the density of fortifications in the Indian subcontinent. And as just to quote them, the Indian subcontinent has perhaps the densest accumulation of pre-modern fortifications of any global region. The South Asian region has a legacy of over 4,000 years of defensive architecture, represented by thousands of fortifications. However, in their analysis that they did, they found that most of these fortifications actually do not actually date from the ancient period. It's between 9th to 17th century that you get this kind of densification of fortifications. And the reason for this is the geopolitical situation at that particular movement, the need for these fortified areas to come up. In the second map that you see, they did an exercise of finding out how close are these fortifications, or are there any networks. So they are looking at this map where they find every next fortification at a distance of 3 kilometers. And you can see out here that two of the regions that are identified, one is the Western Ghats, basically the Maratha area, and the other is the central India, largely the Bundelkhand region. And the third map it's part of our documentation for Niti Aayog on the inventories for various heritage typologies across India, and we could actually map 6,515 fortifications, palaces, and military structures. And again, you see the density is largely in these central areas. So what was the cause for this kind of densification, particularly in the medieval period? We look at the geopolitics and the frontiers. I mean, this is the period when we have, the Mughals are coming into India. We are talking about 1500s, when Akbar is sort of well settled and expanding in northern India. And there are recent studies looking at how the Mughal expanded, because you have maps showing, how much Akbar expanded north, and then how he extended, how Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb further extended, leading right to the Deccan and below. And historians recently have looked at this kind of broad generalization, and they have said that there are much more studies that need to be done. In fact, they are already done, and this is one of them: the Mughal warfare, Indian frontiers and high roads to empire by Jos Gomans. Another study also is by Pratyayanath Change, which in his book Climate of Conquest, where he says that one needs to study the dynamics of the military campaigns that help the Mughals to conquer North India. I mean, one needs to look at military logistics, labor, animals, and the organization of war, because it was really a massive endeavor, and formation of imperial frontiers. So Mughal empire building as a highly adaptive, flexible, and accommodative process is currently being looked at. And through this approach, one comes up with these local regional state formations, such as Bundelkhand, and maybe to a much larger scale, the Maratha state formation. If you see the map out here, so you can see this particular line is the inner frontier, that is, inner and outer frontiers that are defined by Jos Gomans in his book. And you can see Bundelkhand and the Western Ghats being, very prominent out here. So, as he says, more permanent Mughal expansion required the taking of several well-fortified strongholds surrounded by difficult and often uncultivated terrain that made the siege of such places and across the Western Ghats siege of such places an enormous logistical challenge. This either required the taking of the shortest supply lines across the Western Ghats or provision by long-distance grain carriers from Malwa and Berar region. So basically, it's these regions, since they are located, the Mughals are located here, and they basically use the Uttarapath and the Dakshinapath. I will show in another map. So they needed these kind of, areas where they could traverse through without any problem and have bases there. And this is actually the basis of emergence of such small state formations. After a long, protracted sieges, they could actually take the forts of Dharur, Daulatabad, Udgir, and Osa. And these became the grain warehouses supplying the army down south. So it's basically till here. I'll show you in another map where Akbar could take till Khandesh area, the entire region. On the right side, this map shows again, where did they get the people to do the warfare. So it was again the locals actually. And in this particular situation, these locals were like zamindar. So the local zamindars became military entrepreneurs, and they would be supplying the labor for war to the Mughals. So again, this becomes very important, and you can see in the region, Bundelas and Marathas, very well known for their, warfare and for their bravery, definitely. Rajputs, of course, are there, but Rajputs specifically from Rajasthan, most of them allied and became high-level commanders for the Mughals. So if we look at the geographical peculiarities, what I just mentioned, this is Bundelkhand region. You have all the, the hills and the rivers going through, and there were big areas, forested areas, which the Mughals could not traverse through while taking the route. And then there were arable lands. So they had to somewhere navigate between the two and also get the locals with them to look at these particular areas and to take over further down. And similarly in Western Ghats, you have the Konkan coast and you have the Western Ghats, and the number of passes that traverse through these were actually the major trade routes, always largely under the control of the Marathas. This is the map of Mughal India, 16th century, just before the rise of the Bundelas and, before the rise of the Marathas for sure. You can see the areas, the dates when Akbar is annexing these, and he could actually get this into his empire by 1630, and after that it was basically Shah Jahan and largely Aurangzeb who tried to take over these other areas and face the challenges with the Bundelas and the Marathas. This shows the trade routes of 1595 as mapped by Irfan Habib, and you can see large areas here in terms of what kind of trading was going on, basically the elephants that the Mughals sourced for their army. And just to explain, what was the situation for these local, regional zamindars. Along fringes, there were several little kingdoms that could successfully resist Mughal incorporation, since they could easily retreat into these dense wildernesses. Most of these principalities were neither poor nor primitive. On the contrary, their reputation was one of being extremely wealthy, most of their riches reportedly being buried or hidden at the bottom of secret wells and caves. In a way, they had become the natural depots of the dregs of Indian bullion streaming along the major highways of Hindustan. In addition, many of these states could build on the revenues from intensive paddy cultivation, the sale of elephants, and in some cases the exploitation of important pilgrimage routes. For example, according to the N.A. Akbari, the cultivators of Gond state of Ghara paid the revenue in golden mohurs and elephants. Their produce alone was considered sufficient to fully supply both Gujarat and the Deccan. Hence, although these areas never became entirely integrated into the empire, the Mughals had a great deal of interest in them, as may be witnessed by their various plundering raids. So this is quoting Joe's comments on the entire analysis, and these kind of examples can be seen in Bundelkhand when Shah Jahan was actually attacking Orcha. During the rule of Jujhar Singh, he actually, Jujhar Singh had to move into the dense forest, had to take refuge by the Gonds, and who killed Jujhar Singh, and Akbar could get, Shah Jahan could actually get a lot of loots both from the Gonds as well as by annexing Orcha and Jhansi area. And it's recorded that he was actually looking at all this loot inside the storages, in the wells and other areas. That's mentioned in the Shah Jahanama. So now looking at the genealogy. So I'm just going to explain what all areas I'm going to cover and under which reign. So we see the Mughal interaction. It starts with Akbar as he's taking over the Bundelkhand region, which is one main area that he wanted to take over before moving down to the Deccan. Jahangir and Shah Jahan. Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and then Aurangzeb, which is, the main battle with the Marathas and the Bundelas. So in this particular situation, we have Bundelas who started from Orcha, and then there was another branch of Bundela from Panna, which actually deviated the Orcha branch. The main origin was Rudra Pratap from Orchha, he established the capital in Orchha, but he moved from Garkundar. And originally, the Bundela clan actually comes from Pancham in Kashi in the 14th century. But they basically started rising with this particular figure, which is Bir Singh Dev. If you see the date, 1605 to 1627 is actually almost aligns with the same time as the reign of Jahangir. And what Bir Singh Dev did was, he was in the first ruler, Rudra Pratap. After that, Bharti Singh and Madhukar Shah, these were the ones who were trying to battle with the Mughals and, managing their area of Bundelkhand. But once Bir Singh Dev, he resisted Akbar, and finally what he did was he killed Akbar's closest minister and writer, Abul Fazl, because he became a threat to Salim, to Jahangir, for his throne. And that is how he could ally himself with Jahangir. So the moment Jahangir took over the throne, Bir Singh Dev was given the throne of Orchha. Orchha was the capital of the Bundelas, and his elder brother Ram Shah was settled by giving Chanderi as another area to him. So Bir Singh Dev is one of the main Bundela ruler who actually, because of his close association with Jahangir, could, really create Bundela architecture as a phenomenal movement, or he was one of the greatest patron of architecture, and he actually is the one who defined what Bundela architecture style is, if we look at his buildings. And then you have, the next one, Chhatrapati, who was another main person who's, in this case, you see from Bir Singh Bundela, who's actually helping and aligning with Jahangir. But after that, the Bundelas again split and in various branches, and they would be either working against or, with the Mughals, depending on the particular situation. In some cases, you see, Jujhar Singh, I've already mentioned how he was, trying to revolt against and was killed in the jungles. There are others like Indramani Singh, who was actually sent with Jai Singh to dialogue to actually attack Purandar when Chhatrapati Shivaji was when Aurangzeb sent Savai Jai Singh to, capture Chhatrapati Shivaji in 1665 during the Purandar Treaty. So Indramani was involved there. At the same time, Chhatrasal was a very young person. His father was Champat Rai, who was from the Panna family of Bundela. And Champat Rai has a very interesting history because he was the one who had actually been, worked or whatever, had relation with all these four Mughal emperors. In some cases, initially he helped Bir Singh Dev to kill Abul Fazl. Then he also helped Aurangzeb initially against Dara Shikoh, but then he had some conscious awakening, because of which he felt that he should not be working for the Mughals and he should create something of his own in Bundelkhand. So when Chhatrasal was sent in 1665 with Jai Singh for the Purandar treaty and for taking the fort of Purandar, at that time he met Chhatrapati Shivaji. He ran away from the main, the Mughal army and went to meet Chhatrapati Shivaji, specifically asking him if he can join his army. And Chhatrapati Shivaji said that, no, what you should do is just go back to Bundelkhand and do your, work for your own area. That is what the historical records mention, but we really don't know what exact dialogue happened in this particular, situation. But they do mention in Bundelkhand and in documents of Chhatrasal that he got inspired by Shivaji, and that's when he came back and he started, conquering all the fortifications in and around Bundelkhand. And at that time, there was one particular situation where in the 1720s, he faced problems with the Mughals and he was being attacked. And And at that time, Marathas were really strong. We had Baji Rao I from 1720 to 40, who was expanding all over. And that's the time Chhatrasal asked Baji Rao for help, and Baji Rao came to help, though as a result of that support, Chhatrasal gave part of his territory to Baji Rao Peshwa, and that's where we see the Marathas moving in, all over Bundelkhand after that. And of course, the confederacy that later happened, I'm not talking about the Holkars and the Gaikwads or, others that spread all over. But in my closing slide, I'll just mention that. In my particular presentation, what I'm focusing on is Bir Singh Dev Bundela, who actually defined Bundela architecture vocabulary. And secondly, Chhatrapati Shivaji, who actually created the Maratha state identity and the fortification designs. And I'm talking about these because these are, architectural landscape endeavors which deviated from the conventional Mughal or Deccan Sultanate styles. And so we are just going to look at these particular aspects on what was the difference, or was there a difference? Were they just borrowing from the Mughals or Deccan Sultanate or others, or did they really create something, that was exceptional? So moving on to the patrons, I start with the Bundela period, and Rothfab, who's researched Orcha and Orcha specifically quite well. So what I'm going to present is largely summarizing his works and some other aspects related to planning of Orcha specifically beyond the reign of Bir Singh Dev. But what he says about Bir Singh Dev is he's the greatest architectural patron in early 17th century Hindustan. Indeed, so lavish and wide-ranging was this patronage that even over 100 years after Bir Singh Dev's death, the Mathir al-Umar, an 18th century biographical compendium of Mughal nobles, linked his reign with the construction of lofty buildings surpassing of others. This was the beginning of the Bundelas. You can see this very modest temple, the Vridvahini Devi, which is the family deity of the Bundela chiefs. And even this is a current picture of the temple. So this temple remained modest despite the fact that Bir Singh Dev very, lavish temples in Orcha and other places, including Braj and surrounding areas. But this particular, deity, and what Rothfab says is maybe the Devi temples were, always they remained modest and scaled in that sense. This is a view of Garkundar, one of the military palaces that he created. And this was created by Bir Singh Dev. Though the Garkundar was the origin of the Bundelas, Rudra Pratap was here from 1501 to 1531, and he shifted the capital to Orcha in 1531 and started making the fortifications there. But we don't have any remains of what existed when Rudra Pratap was there, because this particular fort that you see of Garkundar, which is quite exceptional, was created by Bir Singh Dev later in between 1605 and 1627. In fact, between 1620 and 27. And you can see, the kind of scale. What is interesting about the Bundela palace fortresses in this particular period is that they all had an underground space. So from the courtyard itself, you can go down, and all the chambers below were largely used by soldiers or for storage. So this was, we'll see later the other palace fortresses. This is much bigger in scale and definitely designed more as a military structure rather than a residential structure. Moving on to 1531, when they formed Orcha. So you can see the initial period where you have Bharti Chand and Madhukar Shah just before Bir Singh Bundela. The constructions that they did, one was the Ram Raja Mandir, which is called now, was just a square courtyard palace, and it's named Rani Mahal. But that was the original structure. And later on, this bridge between the citadel, this particular citadel fortification, and then entire fortification all around. So these were some of the initial constructions next to this river Betwa that you see and the forest around. And it was called Orcha, which is actually, the term is Unde Cha, which means the hidden valley, like a hidden space. And this was selected by Rudra Pratap because he felt it will be a safer place from the Mughals and compared to Gharkondar, because of this situation of being surrounded by forest areas. So in the next phase, this is where Bir Singh Dev, you can see, what he constructed, the citadels. You have, several, like out here, you have one palace citadel. I'll talk about this Raja Mahal coming up. And later on, you have Bir Singh Dev, subsequently, developing all these areas. You have the Jahangir Mahal. This is the place where his nobles were staying. So a lot of construction in this, and some temples in this area. So within this citadel space, you see another fortified area, which was basically the residential area, and also had, nobles out here. And then you have the cenotaph area here, another temple constructed by him, which is at the highest point, the Lakshmi Narayan temple, and another one, Chaturbhuj, out here. And then, of course, the last phase where there were no major constructions, this is where the Bundelas of Orcha again had a very waxing and waning relationship with the Mughals. Sometimes they were with them, sometimes they were trying to be against them. And Orcha lost its importance. So this was basically the peak point of Orcha and what I'm going to show you largely. This is what I was explaining. So you have the citadel, you have the cenotaphs here, you have the Ram Raja and the Chaturbhuj temple here, Lakshmi Narayan, and the fortified wall of the entire city. And you can see this settlement, the wall actually goes up till here across the island. And you have one temple, the Chitrakoot temple, which comes on this axis. This is basically the city axis, which is across this Betwa river. And possibly, this is a fortification that we've recently discovered. It was lost because none of the government departments were aware of it. We could just mark this fortification, but when we started working on the UNESCO dossier, we went through the forest. This is a protected sanctuary area, and we could actually find the remains of this still existing. And there may be archaeological excavations carried out to figure whether it completed at any point till this temple. So in terms of the typology, it has, the citadels, gates, bridges, cenotaphs, temples, palaces, gardens, hammam and havelis, and several service structures. It's really like one of the very unique settlements of Bundela, the first capital and most evolved. You can see here the phases of construction. As I said, largely the construction was carried out during Bir Singh Dev's period. And what you see on right is a painting by Tez Dast, the Mughal period painting, where you can see Shah Jahan is actually attacking the fort of Orcha, what I was talking about, during the reign of Jujhar Singh. And you can see this particular bridge and the citadel area here, though it was Tez Dast made this painting based on description, not an actual, not actually looking at the particular space. So you can see it's only indicative. Only the bridge and the citadel is somewhere there, but the forms and all are very indicative and not in detail. So looking at Orcha, how it was, this is, Princeps images of what the town looked like, or when the town was not there, what the site looked like, would be, these large granite rocks. The forest was on one side and Betwa River as a setting, which was ideal for defense. You can see the map out here. So the levels show how it's decreasing. This is the topmost point where you see Lakshmi temple is located. And then you have the complete axis going like this through the other temples and the palaces. This is showing the planning in alignment with the natural terrain, how it was designed. So this is when you are standing on top of Lakshmi Narayan temple, you can actually see the skyline. These two small domes, which were actually later on made by Bir Singh Dev. This was just a small courtyard structure of the Rani Mahal, now converted into Raja Ram Temple. And this one is Raja Mahal, which was constructed by Madhukar Shah inside the citadel area, and then the grandest one, which is the Jahangir Mahal. And beyond these palace citadels, or what Giles Tillotson calls the Gad palaces, typical of Rajput architecture, and beyond these, you can see created really lavish temples. This particular one of 17th century temple style is one of its kind. There were only 4 such temples in northern India, which were as per the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, slightly modified. And out of these 4, this is the only one that remains completely intact. The other one, Govind Dev, made by Man Singh, was demolished partly. And then, of course, you have other temples again in the skyline that he created. This again gives you, an idea of the complete axis as seen from Lakshmi Narayan Mandir. So you have the Chaturbhuj, the Rani Mahal or Ram Raja Mandir, the Raja Mahal, and then the Jahangir Mahal. And the skyline that you see from Jahangir Mahal, so if you're looking at reverse, in a reverse manner, we can again see this axis. So you have Chaturbhuj, Ram Raja Mandir. You can see Raja Mahal, seeing from the Jahangir Mahal, and then Lakshmi Temple right out there. So what is interesting here is, if I'm looking at the period of, say, when this temple was built, when this palace was built. This was the first palace built by Rudra Pratap and Bharti Singh, actually. Rudra Pratap hardly had time here. And then this was the second one with Madhukar Shah built. And Jahangir Mahal was built at the highest point. So you can see Bir Singh Dev, actually used all the high points. Why did the previous rulers, not construct as per this terrain? Why were they looking at a palace which is lower and not visible? So again, in this context, if we look at the geopolitics, because both Madhukar Shah and Bharti Singh, as well as Rudra Pratap earlier, the reason they selected Orcha was because it's hidden, and the reason that they are not actually boldly looking at creating an architectural form. One, of course, it's the position, the alliance that they have with the Mughals, but also in terms of resources, like Rothwap says, maybe the resources were not there. And as I mentioned, that the resources in some cases used to be there, but it's not that you want to use the resources for lavish architecture where you will be, suddenly become very prominent and might be prone to attacks. So this, in some ways, I would say an approach similar to the case of Maratha, where you see that the fortifications that are built are almost camouflaged with the hills. You don't know where the landscape is and where the settlement or the fortification is. So that possibly was the initial approach. But when Bir Singh Dev had alliance with Jahangir, he had all the resources. He also had the go-ahead from the Mughal ruler to do whatever he wants. And he had the Mughal atelier, which was quite close, in Agra, that he could get all the craftspeople. So we look at this particular aspect of Bir Singh Dev's architecture, though I'm not talking about temples, but this is something I couldn't resist showing because it shows what kind of architecture evolved. It is something what we call, eclectic borrowings, but there is an approach to these eclectic borrowings, and I have never seen this kind of phenomenal creation or vocabulary, with other styles in such a synchronized manner. So here you see, the Shikhara, but you have, the hall, which is because of the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, it was, you needed a bigger mandap area. And so this has really become, is one of the biggest hall. This is a closer look. You can see the kind of formations. There is no other temple I can compare it with, which of this particular period or before or after, which would have this kind of vocabulary. You see all the elements that are taken, the chhatris and the spire itself. And this is the inner mandap area, which I said that the need for having a larger congregation, but you can see that how the Mughal elements and Mughal Sultanate and the indigenous local elements, such as you see in Chanderi, as well as the nearer fort that they had was Gwalior Fort, and Tomar Rajputs, who had these similar elements, architectural elements. So this is the Ram Raja temple, now completely transformed. The original one would just have been, a square courtyard with the surrounding. These were later added by Bir Singh Bundela, probably to give it to enhance it a bit, and these would have actually been on all four sides. But during one of the annexes, either by Shah Jahan or later on by Marathas, these two were damaged, and you can just see, that these are only half wings, only this one is seen complete. It's completely painted over because it's under a temple trust, so there is no kind of, conscious approach to conservation for this particular temple. It is more of, it's a very important pilgrim place now, and this is one of the reasons why conservation is not being looked at. Lakshmi Narayan temple, you can see it, from a particular height, how it looks. And you can see, a historic image and certain changes that were made at a later stage. So this was again made by Bir Singh Bundela. You can see this particular element, which is called a palki roof. I will show it, a Gaj Prisht roof, which is like an elephant's hump, and I'll show you later. So these are particular elements that were developed with the Bundela architecture. And this planning that I'm talking about the citadel and across the Betwa river, all this is actually mapped in this Lakshmi Narayan temple mural of late 18th, early 19th century. You have the cenotaph complex. Again, you can see, a very unusual form, which comes out of the amalgamation of Rajput, Mughal, and Sultanate vocabularies mixed together to create a completely different form. It uses, in terms of its garden planning, uses, the particular Mughal garden layout. Only in this particular area of cenotaphs, the citadel has a totally different character, which is the Bundela gardens, and also the Hasht-Visht plan for the cenotaphs. But as you can see, the shikhar is totally different. So in this, we've mapped around 177 structures. Besides these major monuments, you have a number of heritage structures within the citadel complex and all around. But coming to the citadel complex, so this, what you see is basically, the Jahangir Mahal and part of the Raja Mahal area in front, and Betwa beyond. So coming to this citadel area, you have, as I mentioned, the citadel fortification, the Adawar bridge that was also created by Bir Singh, and you have, the palaces, two palaces, the garden area. These are some historic images showing, the bridge approach to Raja Mahal and then the Jahangir Mahal and the gate, entrance gate. That is now part of the Raja Ram complex. So another view that shows the Adwar bridge, and you can see the OG arches adopted by Bir Singh Dev, and the two palace structures along with the fortifications. So the fortification otherwise is quite simple, because I'll talk about fortifications in the Maratha period also. You can see it's just a very simple fortification, in terms of protection, not really very strong. And in most cases, when you see when the Mughals attacked, in most cases the Bundela Rajputs would just give in, without any fight. But what is interesting about this fortification, which I've never seen anywhere else, is in this particular bastion, you actually have a well. So the design of a bastion where you also have a well is sort of looking at people who are fighting and also need the requirement of water with that. So it's a very interesting typology that I have not till now found in any other fort across India anywhere. And it's sort of a unique feature found in Bundela forts, in this particular one, of course. You can see the citadel, the wall, inside wall. This, of course, is even, just for the sake of it, not really a defensive wall. You don't see any loopholes or any defensive features there. And this is the view from Betwa. So obviously the wall here was much smaller. You had the natural protection of the river on this side, and of course the rough rocks that you see out here. So moving on to the particular palaces, you have the Raja Mahal that was built by Madhukar Shah, and this is an analysis that Tillotson gives, which again Rothfarb also reiterates, where you have the simplest form of the Rani Mahal around a courtyard. You have the Raja Mahal, so you can see the punctuations and how in different ways the Raja Mahal was there was an experiment pushing in and pushing out certain surfaces to give it that visual appeal. And then you have the Jahangir Mahal, where you have additions of these battered bastions kind of structure on all four corners, which was very typical, and you borrowed from the Gwalior Tomar, from the Gwalior region of Tomar Rajput palaces, but also from it comes from the Tughlaq period, this particular feature. And you can again see how it was, on the plan, of course, as an architect, you can see how it comes up, but we'll look at the visuals. And so this actually shows the Bundela palace evolution very nicely by, the simplest structure, which was local, no particular influence of Mughal or Sultanate architecture. Out here you see some influence, and out here you see a complete, understanding of elements from all across and how they are used. And finally, the culmination into this particular one, which is the Datya Palace that I'll show you, which is at a distance from Orchha, where Bir Singh made his last palace after Jahangir Palace, the Datya Palace. So this is a very interesting evolution of the palace form that you see, the Bundela palace form, and not found anywhere else. It's mentioned that the Paramsaika Mandal, the Vastu Purush Mandal, Paramsaika one, which is used for palace design, is what seems to have been used to design all these and to extrapolate. So these are some visuals showing, now you can see Raja Mahal, otherwise, very simple, but you can see the use of extensive arches, and the third level, which is completely see-through with the arches. There is no jali or any other element, and then you have these chhatris all around. Inside the Raja Mahal, you have paintings, again, you can see the localized Bundeli Kalam that integrated the local painting traditions, including the Mughal one, and there was a special Bundeli atelier that was created later during the time of Bir Singh there. This particular painting again belongs to a later period, not to Madhukar Shah's period, probably because Raja Mahal was extended later. You can see introduction of cusped arches, which were during the time of Shah Jahan. So you can see some later additions in this particular structure, and even an extension, and probably that's the time the paintings were also redone. So there are no original paintings currently from Madhukar Shah's period. But you can see the play of, space and void out here, which is the most prominent aspect in these Bundela palace forms. And here you see the Raja Mahal, how it was a complete square in itself, and later on extended in a later period where an additional sabha, or probably for the use of the later rulers, it was extended. You can see the arches also changing shape there. This is the interior situation of Raja Mahal. The paintings, of course, require conservation. More recently, they've got IGNCA to look at the in situ paintings to be conserved in these palaces. And then the Jahangir Mahal, so you can see the more complex form here. And you see in the facade, it very much differs. There is a complete jali screen. Again, you don't find this kind of feature anywhere else in any other palace with a square form and this kind of continuous facade on the exterior. You have a painting of Jahangir in this particular palace. It is called Jahangir Mahal because it is said that Bir Singh Dev built it as a tribute to Jahangir. Whether Jahangir came here or not, some people say he came here for a day, but there is no evidence or record whether he really came or not. And also why it was called Jahangir Mahal, because there are, if you look at what Ratwab says, the Riti literature, what Keshav Das wrote during the time of Bir Singh, does not mention this as Jahangir Mahal specifically. But it's through various times, because of their close relationship or some references, it's now called Jahangir Mahal. But you can see, the beauty of this palace. So again, it's the interiors that is more dynamic, the kind of skyline, the domes with the kalash, very typical Rajput. And then this particular feature that you see, in Bundela, Bir Singh Dev's time, that these smaller ones on the sides of domes also feature, and not, just once or twice or on the main one, but there is a repeat, there is a complete rhythm. The punctures are at 4 corners and the middle spaces, so in total 8, that add to this particular skyline. Again, you see out here, there is a basement. So there is a storage, there are, quarters below, which were used for the soldiers and for storage. And there is a system of even water going down there. The basement is currently what the archaeology department is exploring to look at and understand how they can, conserve that particular area. Very interesting elements that you may not find anywhere else. So this is the exterior facade of Jahangir Mahal, and you see this sort of detail where you have, an opening and then the Torana feature, and then you have, the jali. So you have the Mughal jali feature, you have this particular element picked from, the Gwalior Tomar Rajput dynasty, and then you have the typical Rajput Mughal features integrated as chhatri, the brackets, and interestingly, it comes both as solid and void. So you have this at some places and that you have this right opposite. And it's a very interesting play. So you can think of the kind of experimentation and the kind of people who were working on these buildings, the, innovation that you see out here in these palaces is very rare to find. These are some views of Jahangir Mahal showing the kind of, visual culture that was created as part of Bundela architecture, which is unprecedented or unparalleled in any other contemporary Rajput or Mughal palace of this period. So you can again see the kind of, visuals and the feel that it creates on the skyline, including the jali. And a very contemporary kind of approach. You see just, here you don't have the arches, you have the regular lintels with the jali, and then of course the chhatris of different styles creating this skyline. You also have this particular use of the glazed tiles. Again, you see it in the Man Mandir by Tomar Rajputs in Gwalior. And Gwalior was quite just about, 20 years before, the Gwalior had sort of gone down as it was taken over. 1526, it was taken over by the Mughals, Akbar, and that's when the Tomar Rajputs So that's when the Tomar Rajputs lost their importance, and that's where you see that there are borrowings from the Gwalior area of this particular feature. And of course the skylines, again with the particular kind of chhatris that you see here. The exterior facade that I was mentioning, so this particular, way of treating exterior with complete screens, and possibly this was also because in these courtyard palaces, you don't see the Mardana and the Zanana separate, as you see in case of Mughals or later Rajput period palaces. In case of Bundela Palace, you see that these are controlled like around the courtyard, and it's basically the same space, and maybe the levels at different level are used for privacy. So this could be one possibility, but this kind of exterior screened is also very rare to see in any palace fortress. The front east side entrance of Jahangir Mahal, and here you see again, innovations integrating elements which are largely from the Gwalior Tomar region, also from Chanderi, the kind of elephants, stone brackets, also from nearby Gwalior and Chanderi, and then of course the Jalis, Mughal Sultanate period features all together, blended in a very sophisticated manner. This is the interior ceiling of this entrance gate. Very unique feature. I mean, I have not seen a reflected ceiling with this kind of pattern, but again, this inspiration from the mandala, it appears at various places. These are the stone brackets with the elephants, very typical of the Rajput architecture of that period. And then, of course, jalis such as this, because if it's a Mughal palace, you would really find just the geometric jalis. But these kind of features are these kind of jalis are very typical of the Rajput palace fortresses. Adjoining to this, of course, there were other structures that he built. It's called the Oont Khana, but it doesn't seem that there were camels that could be put here. We are not sure why it has been termed as Oont Khana, but it was probably an area for gathering, like a area of gathering with the special people, nobles and all, like a sabha. But it's still not clear the purpose of this particular area. Across that, you have huge gardens. This is the Anand Bagh. You can see octagonal flower beds out here, which are very different from the Mughal gardens. And the Rai Parveen was a courtesan of a later Bundela ruler, and the palace was built for her. And she was actually one of the learners of Riti culture from the famous Keshav Das, the Riti scholar of that period. But this, again, what is said is that this was actually, there was some garden existing during the time of Bir Singh Dev, which was later refurbished during the time of Indramani Singh, as when Rai Parveen, who was courtesan to Indramani, was staying here. And these areas, beyond this, you see the fortification, you see, the other temples. And finally, you reach here to the ghat, which is called the Vanvasi Ghat. And this is where you can actually go around into the forest area to the Chitrakoot temple, which is across and the end of the skyline. So, summarizing, you look at Orcha, which has unique palace guards and historic gardens, and it became the hallmark of Bundeli architectural style, very different from the Rajput Mughal style. But what was really the epitome of this palace architecture was this particular palace, Datia, which was created as the last one by Bir Singh Bundela. And in Datia, this is again the facade. You find a similar treatment in this facade, but the scale is much more out here. You have the entrance gate, which is, again, you find the Bundeli atelier paintings, typical. This is the facade as recorded in 1872. So you can see the grandeur of this facade. What was unique about this was in the center of the courtyard, there was no empty space. This had, again, the basement or 2 floors below. You had the upper floors. And in the center of this, you have a towered structure coming up, which was the main palace of the ruler. Though this palace was never stayed in. But you can see the kind of experimentation here is really reached to its peak. This is the entrance gate with the paintings where you see dragons chasing gazelles, and otherwise you have, the regular features of the elephant and, the horse warriors. And this is a view of the central structure. So you have a central space that is right going up to the apex, and this has been mentioned that possibly, usually you in a Vastu Purush space or in the Paramsayika, the central space has to be kept empty. So why was this experimentation done where you have a central palace structure coming right till the top? And it has been associated with Mount Meru or Kailash. So in that sense, it's supposedly like a temple in the center, but of course in this case it is supposedly the ruler's residence. And it is connected by bridges all across on all sides. We find a similar kind of pattern here as you see in Jahangir Mahal on the ceiling. These are the views which extend to through the bridges in the center. And again, you can see the Torana feature, how it has been experimented to create a very unique kind of framework. So this was, the visual culture that Bir Singh Bundela created, but it had an impact all across later on. So you see, there are borrowings even during the time of Chhatrasal, but this is what came to be known as Bundela architecture style. And after Bir Singh Bundela, there was no other patron as strong as him who could create this kind of architecture. Moving on to the parallel, what was happening in the Deccan. Now this is 1646 to 1680 when Chhatrapati Shivaji was actually making fortifications all across, and his primary strategy was how to keep the Deccan under control, and he created it across three landscapes. So there were these three geospatial terrains. One was the Sayadri, all across the Western Ghats. The second was the Konkan coast, where he created the sea forts. And the third was on the southeast side going to Jinji, which became the third capital for the Marathas, because when Raigad and Rajgarh were lost, it was Rajaram who stayed in Jinji, and actually that helped him recover these back. So again, looking at Shivaji's, state formation and how he created the fortifications. There are authors like Deloche who's looked at Jinji, which has several historic layers, but he still says that Shivaji may be considered as the last great fort architect. And he captured a number of citadels. Some he refurbished and some he created. So this is a mapping we have of all his fortifications and which ones were reconstructed, partially reconstructed, or they were completely new ones. Because what has been said about Maratha architecture, and especially during the period of Chhatrapati Shivaji, is that there was no specific architectural style that was followed. Whatever was there, if there were new structures, they could actually be looking at the Deccan Sultanate and what was already defined in the period. And in a lot of cases like Panhala and other forts, you do find that. But what was different is something that we need to understand if we look at his fort planning. So again, here, what I mentioned in the Orcha case, that why were they hidden, why were they in a particular situation? In case of Marathas, they were facing attacks all the time, and their whole strategy was of the guerrilla warfare. So they had to create their fortified strongholds in a manner that they will not be seen, or they could retreat to it without any problem. So these are the typical Maratha hill fort design. You would never see it any other fort. This particular extension, which they call Machi, and other features. It took us some time to map all these particular features, like you have the Chilkati Buruj or the triple layered bastion, which again you don't find in any other fortification. Just to give you an idea of the Deccan, the situation in the Deccan at that time, and how the Marathas created this particular network. The Maratha chiefs were involved in the acquisition of territories for the Deccan Sultanate ruler at various posts. So it's again, I mean, like you have alliances with the Mughals, the Marathas were having with Deccan Sultanate. And before they established their independent state, the initiation of this independent identity is visible in the actions of Shahaji Bhosle, that was Shivaji's father, who helped the Nizam Shahis against the Mughals in 1633 to recover the forts at Pune and Shivneri. And later on, when Nizam Shahi was absorbed by the Mughals, he joined the Adil Shahis to acquire the Tamil lands where he occupied Vellore and Jinji. So even much before Shivaji moved to these places, Shahaji already had acquired, and this is what probably Shivaji followed through. Following his footsteps, he took over, he started building forts in the core Mawal region around Pune, and then later on acquired all the previous Nizam Shahi forts. But in 1665, the Treaty of Purandar that I was talking about, where Aurangzeb sent Savai Jai Singh along with some Bundela rulers, he had to give up 23 of his forts, and those were largely the forts of the Nizam Shahis that he had taken over. But of course, he soon recovered from that, and he started constructing many forts by 1670, before declaring his sovereignty officially in 1674 CE. And he also aligned with the Qutub Shahis down south to take over the fort of Jinji and Vellore. So by 1680 CE, Shivaji controlled an area of about 50,000 square miles, or 4.1% of the area of the whole subcontinent. His revenue was between 1/5 and 1/6 of that of the Mughal Empire. In his territory, he had set up a comparatively elaborate administrative apparatus. So in this case, we see that the Marathas' focus in this particular situation was not on palatial architecture. Because of their particular situation, it was basically fortifications that were used for defense, and even the institutional setup was more about governance and military strategies. So this, of course, the sea forts. So what is again unique about this particular situation is the network of the sea forts and the hill forts that he could jointly put together, which was not done by any other contemporaneous polities, be it Siddhis or Deccan Sultanate or the Portuguese or others, or even the Mughals. So what is unique about this particular Maratha strategy is that they had this interwoven fortifications network of 300 forts along this entire space. And this largely, which was called Swarajya, later also has been mentioned in treaties with Aurangzeb, even till the time of Peshwa Bajirao, is the term of Swarajya, where they also had a condition for taking Shivneri and Jinji under that particular area, which was called, the area of their Sardeshmukhi, where they have hereditary rights to take the taxes, whereas the other areas which were expanded on, they would be taking Chauth, which was, the other kind of taxes. But this particular situation was because they knew all these trade routes. There were, hundreds of trade routes between Western Ghats and Konkan, and they controlled this completely, and which is something that the Mughals or the Deccan Sultanate rulers could never understand, the local terrain. And because of this entire area, even in the British records, we see it as being called the Maratha country. So these are typical, features of the hill forts and sea forts that the Maratha designed. And like I said, the palace areas or residence was not really their priority, and we see it in this statement of Vijayadurg. This is a map of Vijayadurg from the CSMVS, created during Maratha time. But what I want to emphasize is this quote by Kincaid. He says, Vijayadurg is the most perfect example of a great coast fortress, which was also as much of a palace as the Maratha chiefs allowed themselves. So you can understand, the situation of the Maratha chiefs, the kind of restrictions and the policies that Chhatrapati Shivaji had, with a singular focus, of just fighting and taking over their own territory and managing it. So no lavishness, though you see a bit of that later on. So what I'm going to just show you is Rajgarh and Raigarh, Briefly, these were, the first and the second capital of the Marathas. The first one that he created in 1946, and the second one in 1974 when he was coronated. What is interesting is the network of other forts that you see and how these were cocooned completely in a valley. If you travel to these forts, you will not see it, till you actually reach there. And even then what you see is just a hill. One could not figure where the fortifications are. So the way they merge into the landscape completely, and the way they also become defensive for to counter attacks. So Rajgarh in that sense became a further defense feature for Raigad, and Purandar here was already one, counterforce for Raigad. So in that sense, there was a chain that was built for defense. It was a complete network that was created. And how were they different from the Deccan Sultanate in terms of designing? Now you look at Rajgarh, I'll start with this capital. When the Nizam Shahis had this, all they did was put a Balakila and a fort out here. When Chhatrapati Shivaji took over, he actually extended these three. So he used these terrains and created something very unique. And this has been, mentioned by Saki Mustad Khan, who was Aurangzeb's last secretary, when the Mughals attacked this fort. It says Fort Rajgarh is a hill second only to the fort of the towered sky. Its circuit is 12 course. Imagination cannot estimate its height. Its thorny jungles and spectre-haunted chasms can be traversed only by the wind. Nothing can descend on it except rain. There is also, this is a historical timeline of Rajgarh, looking at, what was constructed. So it was the Bahmani period and Nizam Shahi. There was very little area in the Balakila and the Citadel Gateway, whereas it was, 10 times expanded by Shivaji on all three sides to create something which was totally impregnable. So you can see this particular area, and then you see these three, which is very typical of Maratha fortifications, and it's called machis in local language, where you are actually creating three more forts. So each works as a fort in itself. If you have an attack here, there is a closure here, and this is 1 fort, 2, 3, and 4. So they are strengthened further. This is a mapping of the attributes of various structures that are available, including the water bodies, where again they were not actually creating extensive water systems like the Deccan or the Mughals or even in the Bundela forms you see that. But in this case, they actually went back to the traditional ways, what the Yadavas were using, basically cutting on the basalt rock to come up with water systems. So you have very typical features again out here. And this shows, I will not get into the detail, but the kind of defensive features you have in each. These are the bastions that are marked, and the design of bastions was also very unique to what he did. Again, this is a quote from Saki Mustad. He actually has given the whole design, so we know for sure this was, his innovation. And he says, in former days, the Adil Khani kings possessed it. Shiva, after gaining possession of Rajgarh, made terraces on the three sides around it on lower level, Machi, and there built three strong forts, namely Suvela, Padmavati, situated towards the Konkan uplands, and Sanjeevani on the side of Konkan lowlands. He thus made it capture by any enemy impossible. He had formed a triangular enclosure which is called Soond, or elephant's trunk in the language of military fortification, by erecting two thick walls from the postern gate of the fort of Padmavat to the end of hillock, and making these two walls meet at a point. Below both these walls, the path declines so sharply and is so full of slippery holes that no one can pass there on foot. At the junction of the two walls, he built an even stronger tower which opened upon the back of the hillock opposite it. Here he had collected war materials. So this actually explains the entire strategy, and what you see out here, the double, triple kind of fortification is very typical. We can see it in section here. On how on each side there were double defenses. So if somebody attacks from here, there are people inside here to defend out here also, and it's quite challenging to actually take over such forts. So this particular feature, which is called the Chilkati Buruj, is again a very typical Maratha fortification feature. And you can see it here in the Sanjeevani Machi, how it works. There were, of course, some iconography, and you find it in the Vijayanagara period. You also fortifications. You also find it in the Deccan fortifications. And there is a lot of research on, whether the sharab came from Persia or whether it was an indigenous form, because it has been used several times in various ways. But basically, it indicates, sovereignty, or power, and was used extensively even in the Maratha forts. And of course, the iconic Hanuman is typically Maratha. This is a view of the Sanjeevani, of the Padmavati Machi, where you see the water body, and then you have very simplistic structures like the Sadar, that you see out here, just a simple structure, and a postern gate. This is the escape gate down the hill, which was also linked to the villages, for access during wartime. So their supplies could come from the villages. This is a view of another Machi, and then the main gate, which is the Pali gate. So you have one gate out here, and then you go around this to come to this main gate. So this is the Pali gate, and you have an indirect entrance going up. Very difficult to attack if there is, anybody coming with force. You cannot really climb up easily to batter the doors out here. And the top Balekila, which may have some remains of the Deccan period, but this is largely the situation from top. So you can see that there could be remains of the Vadas and other elements. Already in his second capital, Raigad, there more of the remains can be seen, but in Rajgarh, a lot of archaeology and excavation is required yet to determine what these remains are and the residential features. This is a view of Raigad, the second Maratha capital, and then you see, the architectural elements here, which are typically Maratha, and here you can see a well-defined Maratha fort planned with all the structures, including, the throne area, the Nakar Khana, the residential areas, the water body, and the bazaar pate. I'll show you later. This is a mapping. This was also with the Shilahara, a small area, and later on used by Nizam Shahis even as a prison. So it was basically a very small area used in a similar manner like the Balekila, but there are no remains, because when Chhatrapati Shivaji took over, then he cleaned up everything. It was a completely new fort planned in a very lavish manner. This is a complete mapping of the fort. Another typical feature of Maratha forts, the indirect entrance. So you can't really, you just see two bastions here. We don't know whether there is an entry, but this is the entry to the main gate or the Mahadarwaza. And again, the use of typical features, but this shows you how it is, and a roundabout entry. And the kind of defense. So you can see the fortifications and the kind of defense. So basically if we are looking at these two bastions, the view from this creates a situation where there is no blind spot. So anybody coming to the gate would be visible and can be, controlled. These are examples of other bastions. Again, the Chilkati Buruj that they have, and the Khublada bastion. Very interesting shape at Raigad itself. The Nakar Khana, so these are typical Maratha features. Definitely the arch is associated with the Deccan Sultanate architecture. And of course the Maratha chiefs, whether it was Shahji or his grandfather Maloji, they were also controlling Shivneri and were in charge of the constructions there, despite the fact that it was with the Nizam Shahis at that time. So it's something that they were also familiar with, and it evolved. Interesting features like these pavilions, which could be, it is guessed that might be pleasure pavilions, but we are not really sure what these structures were used for. And then, of course, the remains that you see these are the Queen's chambers, the throne room that you see out here. Good thing is that there is a lot of archaeological excavation already conducted in Raigad. You can see the bazaar pate, where you had the bazaars, very unique feature of this particular fort, the water body. And again, in this particular temple feature, you see, the borrowing of some Deccan Sultanate elements, but very minimally. So again, the architecture approach out here is minimal, no ornamentation. And you have the inscription by the architect of Raigad. These are the recent excavations that show the Wada areas. So like you have the nobles areas in the Orcha plan, which are currently being excavated by archaeology department there. You have the Wadas in Raigad in a similar situation where one is figuring what these residences were and who were the people who lived there. So now to the last point, which is the Bundela Maratha interactions. Like I said, in 1665, Chhatrapati met Shivaji during the Treaty of Purandar, and he picked it as an inspiration to go back to Bundelkhand and recover what was there, because since the time of Bir Singh Bundela and Orcha, since 1627, Bundelkhand had just lost its significance. So he was the son of Champat Rai. As I said, Champat Rai had served, was in interaction with four rulers. But finally, during the time of Aurangzeb, he had to actually commit suicide because of the situation that he was in, and he was being ambushed by Aurangzeb. This is what impacted Chhatrapati and why he wanted to revolt. So after that, we see Chhatrapati came back, and he's actually conquered the Bundelkhand forts, Kalinjar, Ajaygarh, Banda, Panna, Dhamoni, Kalpi, Jhansi, and other forts. So Jhansi was one fort built by Bir Singh Bundela and quite near Orcha. And he was the first Bundela ruler to oppose the Mughal rule and declare independence or have Bundelkhand as an independent area. You see Jhansi out here, the fort built by Bir Singh Dev Bundela but taken over by Chhatrapati later. And this was also the fort when Muhammad Shah Bangash was attacking Bundelkhand in 1728. That's the time Chhatrapati asked Peshwa Bajirao for help. And as a gesture of that help, he gave large tracts of land around Jhansi and Sagar to the Peshwa. So you see this particular Jhansi fort built by Bir Singh Bundela passing on from Chhatrapati to Peshwa Bajirao, who actually put a local, governor, Maratha governor appointed here. And finally, you see the later changes in this particular fort till, the first freedom struggle when you had Rani Jhansi fighting from here. You see the Maratha period features and additions of this, like the cavalier in the bastion area. And the other architectural endeavors of Chhatrapati included Dubela, which was his monsoon capital. But here you feel, the architectural vocabulary of Orcha is sort of lost. You have very simplistic structures which can link to the Mughal amalgamation of features, and you also have the cusped arches coming in post Shah Jahan period. So you do have very picturesque palaces here, but in terms of innovation or experimentation, there are some similarities with Bundela architecture, and of course this is Bundeli architecture, but in terms of innovation and experimentation, it is not as exceptional as we found Orcha. This is a cenotaph of Chhatrapati in Dubela because he was married, Peshwa Bajirao was married to his daughter Mastani, and it is said that the cenotaph was started by Peshwa Bajirao, finally finished by his grandson. So you can see again, the typically Bundeli architecture, but here you have, the Maratha patron who's making it, who also created the Shaniwar Wada in Pune in the same time, to the short period of 1720 to 1740 when he was there. So this is, towards the end, you have Rani Mahal in Jhansi by Nevalkars, typical of the later Maratha style architecture. So you can see these cusped features, and this is what we today recognize as the late Maratha period architecture. Extensive cusped arches and decorative features which were, sort of blended, and they also used it and created really some exceptional palaces especially during the time of Ahilyabai Holkar, the temples that were created using similar features. So this is what we today identify as the Maratha stylistic features, which is again blended form of the Mughal features. After the Third Anglo-Maratha War and recognition of various Maratha and Bundela chiefs under the princely states, the construction of citadels had stopped, and you just have a new genre of the palace architecture that you see in the Scindias, the Holkars, or the Gaikawars, which of course was a completely different genre but exceptional in its own manner. So coming to the last section, looking at archaeology and conservation, we are looking at Orchha, where UNESCO New Delhi has joined hands with the Madhya Pradesh Tourism to look at a heritage-based urban planning for sustainable development in Orchha as well as Gwalior. So what they are really looking at is this kind of development. Can we stop this from growing up and spoiling this entire picturesque skyline, the entire axial planning or the beauty of Orchha itself? And currently, this is what the collector is putting in place, regulations for this particular aspect. All the view sheds need to be maintained, a detailed documentation of the kind of architectural typologies that exist and how we can phase it out for conservation. These are 4 major areas identified for taking up for conservation as well as tourism works, and identifying, the prioritized area in the citadel itself. Already work has started in the outer areas and some work in the Jahangir Mahal also. And this is a list of work showing, where what is the whole purpose. And this is a dialogue between the state tourism and the state archaeology that this work is developing. Recently, Orchha has also received about 99 crores as to be developed as a tourism destination by the Ministry of Tourism. And of course, the concern is that if we go overboard with tourism before conservation, then we may lose certain layers. There are a number of teams working on different aspects or different areas, as I showed, and looking at, there should be a synchronized way of creating, of conservation as well as for tourism development. There is a toolkit that has been designed which looks at, the vocabulary that needs to be followed. In particular, the kind of features that are there, because even during conservation, one needs to be careful that if we have this particular arch, it should not become round or a different shape, which we often find when we go on site, that the contractor on site has no clue, and he might be familiar with another arch without realizing that stylistically it is supposed to be of a different kind. So the documentation of these becomes very important, because you need to retain the particular feature in the same style as it is. And this is just a view of, the inventory or, the typical features like this. It is very similar to the Bangaldar roof in other Rajput areas. But in case of Orchha, this is called the Gajprist, which is like an elephant with a, back. And you can see the curve has slightly changed here. So one needs to be really, sure of the proportion and the curve, and the mason working on it needs to be familiar, because if you get a mason who's working on a Bangaldar roof from Rajasthan, he may just be prone to creating another shape for it. So these are very important stylistic documentation that need to be done. And similarly for the Maratha forts, because what kind of fort wall are we making? Is it the Deccan period? Because, in terms of archaeology, there are so many layers some of these forts have. It is very important to know what particular style we are looking at, what are the kind of bastions while repairing the fortifications. So these are some guidelines that were created, and in and also documenting them. Like in this case, Jinji, because Deloche had documented and he actually could establish what Chhatrapati Shivaji made, which was different from the Nayak period or from the other periods. So you can see in this case, there are so many layers, you know, the Deccan Sultanate, the Nayak period, and then the Maratha period. And he could actually show where Chhatrapati Shivaji demolished the wall and reconstructed, and he's, you know, created this unified system of combining the three hills. So we know that this particular wall is of different style than this particular wall, and while conserving, we need to be aware of this fact. Records the typical Maratha features in Jinji, like this cavalier which was made by Rajaram after Chhatrapati Shivaji. So all these features need to be documented in detail, typical features of how the coping is. It's another aspect, because most contractors are not aware. Copings in different forts would have different styles. So we need to understand that this was a particular one used by the Marathas, and it's easy to detect. If we are finding this kind of fort wall, then we know it is Maratha period. Things like, on the rampart, this particular size of the stone. There have been occasions when we are just looking at relaying stone, and the contractors asking that can they just put stone slabs. And then we found this original stone on the rampart, and we had to specify that it has to be done in a similar manner. It's difficult to source stones of this scale, but if it needs to be conserved, then we have to take care of these details. And these are the explorations at Salher by the Directorate of Archaeology and Museums and Deccan College, recently done in December. So there was no historical or archival evidence. We just knew that Salher was taken over by the Marathas. And we were questioned on what is the evidence, where is the Maratha layer, when this team took up excavations and they could actually find a very extensive Maratha period wall in Salher and Salota, which is the nearby fort adjacent to it. So that's basically the message, that we need to really look at archaeology as an important source, both for places like Orcha, the citadel, where most of the things are, have gone underground now, and same for the Maratha fortifications. There is hardly anything that we see on surface. So unless we take archaeology as a focus before undertaking any conservation work, we may lose a lot of layers in the process. Thank you. And thanks.